USFRA wants you to engage. Today's farmers and ranchers have a story to tell about how food is grown and raised, and our app now makes it easy. Through the content in the news feed, you'll always be informed about the latest news in agriculture and from food companies. Engage connects to all major social media accounts, so you can easily share images, videos, articles, and more with one click. Go to fooddialogues.com/engage and download it now.
Thanks for joining us on Agri-Pulse.com. Joined today by Steve Kopperud. Steve, appreciate you joining us.
My pleasure.
Steve, for starters, can you give us a bit of an idea of the timeline of your career as far back as you'd like to go, all the way up until the present?
Well, I came to D.C. As a reporter with Miller Publishing when it was purchased by American Broadcasting, and worked in the D.C. Bureau, was chief of the Bureau, and then got a call from the old American feed manufacturers. Wonderful man named Oakley Ray called and said, "Have you ever thought about being a lobbyist?" Once we determined what that paid versus being a reporter, I jumped for it and spent between staff and consultancy to AFIA 35 years with them. In 2000, I joined a friend, started a company called Policy Directions. She retired, wise woman. She retired last year. I'm running out to the end of this year with SLK Strategies, which is my own clients and my own pursuit of issues.
Mm-hmm. So that transition from journalist to agricultural lobbyist, were you covering agricultural issues as a journalist when you were in town?
Completely. I had been managing editor of Feedstuffs for Miller Publishing back in the day. Came to the Bureau here in Washington for Miller Publishing, which within days of arriving, it converted to American Broadcasting Corporation's Publishing Division Bureau. So everything I did was primarily production agribusiness, trade, verged into technologies as biotech started emerging. And the funniest thing, Spence, is that I had taken a vow when I went into journalism school, because my dad was an executive with a number of co-ops back in Minnesota and ended his career as a VP with Land O'Lakes, that I would never have anything to do with agriculture or agribusiness. I was going to be, working for the New York Times, writing the great American novel, and look where we are today.
Mm-hmm. So what was it? I know you joked that it was a paycheck decision, but what really was it that drove you towards agricultural lobbying? Because another thing is, a lot of times when people move from reporter to perhaps the policy side, one might say, they go as a communications director. But I mean, you went full on lobbying rather than.
Yeah, I did. Knowing absolutely nothing about it other than the people I had interviewed. I burned out on DC reporting, to be perfectly frank. When I got here in the early 80s, it was post-Watergate. ABC, of course, we had access. We were part of the White House press corps at the time. And everything was not too different from today. There was no administration spokesman who wasn't lying to you. There was no such thing as good news. If a crop report showed record production, how did we get there? What's the real reason it's a record production? Well, excuse me. And I was getting tired of it. I wasn't looking to win a Pulitzer Prize with agribusiness reporting. I didn't honestly believe that everybody who was talking to me in the government or industry was lying to me. And I was just kind of burned out. And so the call from Oakley came at a perfect time. And I knew the guy I was going to replace. I had interviewed him a number of times. And he kind of gave me the 2-martini lunch version of what an ag lobbyist is. It intrigued me. And because I have never learned to shut my mouth, it was kind of a good fit.
So you mentioned your time with AFIA going back through the years, but folks have told me they kind of see you as a go-to source for animal welfare issues as well. Was that your intended niche within lobbying?
God, no. When I was a baby lobbyist with the old American feed manufacturers, there was a brilliant technical guy who was working for AFMA at the time, named Dr. Howard Frederick, who just retired from the University of Arizona. No, I'm sorry, Arizona State. And he had, on a number of trips to Europe on nutrition and feeding issues, had identified that there was this growing movement, particularly in the United Kingdom, relative to attacks on how animals were raised, what they were fed, how they were medicated. And I had, when he would come back and tell these stories, I had the same reaction most people did, which is, that's absolutely ridiculous. Who's ever going to pay attention to that? And unfortunately, I would have been 100% wrong that no one would pay attention. And when Howard left AFIA, I inherited that part of his portfolio. As I dug into it, I found that it was a far more serious threat than I had ever thought before. When I was a reporter, I had actually done an interview with Dr. Michael Fox, who was head of farm animal issues for the Humane Society of the United States at the time. And I remember when Feedstuffs ran the profile, ran the interview with him. And I had no particular editorial bent one way or the other than he was a personality that was worthy of a story. I got more flack and more negative response. How dare I give him a forum? How dare we Feedstuffs allow him to say those nasty things about agriculture? And it didn't have as much to do with the feeding of animals as it did to do with housing, handling, on-farm surgical, those kinds of issues. And so that had stuck with me when I had joined AFIA, and when Howard left and I inherited the portfolio, I started pursuing that and recontacted Fox. And in 1985, the 1985 Farm Bill, we were notified that Senator Bob Dole, the majority leader of the Senate, the senior senator from the state of Kansas, a ranking member of the Senate Ag Committee, had a number of amendments to the Animal Welfare Act that were going to further regulate biomedical research using live animal models. And a buddy of mine over at the Farm Bureau, Stuart Proctor, he and I sat down and talked about it and said, you know, this is just going to complicate the Farm Bill. We don't need this crap. I asked AFIA's lawyers, Olson and Frank, if they would do a research project for me and tell me whether or not this legislative language was needed. Turned out that there was one provision that USDA would regulate the exercise of dogs used in research that needed new authority. Otherwise, USDA already had all of the administrative authority it needed. Stuart and I approached a woman named Frankie Trull, president of the National Association for Biomedical Research and the Foundation for Biomedical Research, and said, you know, you need to kind of get out of our way on the Farm Bill with this stuff. Yeah, it's part of the Animal Welfare Act, but this is already administrative authority. Can't you come to a compromise on exercise for dogs and make this go away? We have bigger things to worry about. And she agreed to meet with Fox and a woman named Christine Stevens from the Animal Welfare Institute. We spent an afternoon together. We thought we had an agreement on exercise for dogs. I received several boxes of material from Dr. Fox sometimes after that, and it was basically every failed administrative petition that had been filed at USDA relative to dogs in research. And I called Frankie and said, what is up with this? In a far more colorful way than I'm repeating it. And from that point forward, I kind of became the de facto protector of animal ag when it came to the Hill. In the '85 Farm Bill, there was a slight attempt to remove the exemption for on-farm animal production. Most people aren't aware that the Animal Welfare Act carries an exemption for the definition of animal is any live or dead dog, cat, yada, 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 save for animals used in the production of food and fiber, including horses, or animals used in research to enhance the production of food and fiber, including, there's another species, fur. So in any event, That's always been a goal, is to protect that exemption so that farms don't have twice-a-year inspections or once-a-year inspections and all that other happy stuff. So that turned into just a reporter's curiosity about how deep does this go? How many groups are there? How much money have they got? How big a threat are they really? And at the same time, I was watching these same European organizations that Dr. Frederick had identified, and it was becoming very apparent to me that they were starting to export the movement through both philosophy to sympathetic groups in the US, as well as people coming over. This was also right about the time that PETA was organized by Ingrid Newkirk and Alex Pacheco, based on a break-in at a local research laboratory called where monkeys were taken. And that was the now infamous Silver Spring Monkeys case. And then PETA created itself in a warehouse out in Rockville someplace, and kind of the rest, as they say, is history. Farm animal reform movement came out of that. The Animal Welfare Institute, which had pledged to us it didn't have a farm animal agenda, started railing against farming. The Humane Farming Association out of California popped up. HSUS accelerated its farming rhetoric. And so I was the guy, and I started doing speeches around the country for various organizations, basically going, this is what the movement is, this is what they want, this is what you better do, lest you want to, become transition from hog or cattle production to vegetable production.
So you mentioned the genesis of how this all came to be. Is there any particular, battle, legislative or otherwise, since then that left you either particularly scarred or particularly proud of the victory you had won?
There are two of which I'm particularly proud. One was in 1990, when we had, across legitimate animal use, seen an acceleration in violence against facilities. University of Michigan, UCLA, a number of biomedical research universities were being broken into. Research was being destroyed, equipment being destroyed, researchers threatened. We had seen this in Europe in a far more exaggerated fashion. There were actually threats and actions against individuals in Europe. We hadn't seen that here. We had a couple of farms that were hit. We had a couple of packing plants that were hit in the United States. So at that point, we had a coalition that AFI led called the Farm Animal Welfare Coalition. And between that coalition and Frankie Trull's National Association for Biomedical Research and her coalition of biomedical groups called the Washington Animal Research Network, we formed, it was well over 50 organizations, and we petitioned Congress to amend the federal criminal code to make animal rights violence a federal crime, and we were successful. And then 10, 12 years later, we returned and amended that section of the criminal code to provide protection not only to individuals who care and work with animals, but also organizations which advocate on behalf of. So trade associations and producer groups were also protected should their offices be attacked. And it's had a chilling effect on the violence. The violence has dropped off to almost nothing when it comes to animal agriculture. But at the time we were pushing for what we called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, there was a hearing in the Senate before Environment and Public Works in which an animal rights advocate actually said out loud that he could justify human murder to save animals. And even liberal senators who were politically sympathetic to the movement were shocked and taken aback. And that kind of began the momentum for the movement. I mean, the final bill was carried by Senator Dianne Feinstein of California, which we never thought would happen. But she, being a smart woman, saw the need for it. So it's had a true, and the FBI testified that at that time, in monitoring domestic terrorism, that what they called eco-terrorism and animal rights violence were the #1 causes of domestic terrorism in the United States. But like I say, passing that law is one of the prouder moments of my life, in that it provided protection to not only animals but people, more importantly, and kind of drove the crazies underground. Mm-hmm. They still resort to their their goofy undercover videos and their rhetoric, but we haven't seen the kind of physical violence that we were almost getting used to back in the 90s and early 2000s.
Mm-hmm. So either within this portfolio or maybe on some of the other things that you work on, since you first started lobbying, how up until today, how has the job changed? How has what you have to do to accomplish your end result changed over the years?
When I started lobbying in 1982, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have email, we had no electronic connection to the Hill other than telephone lines. So we physically had to be on the Hill all the time. We had to cultivate relationships with staff. They had to know who we were. They had to, and many of those relationships deepened and became friendships, so that, we could step outside the politics and the issues we were working on and just hang, And I make no bones about it. Being able to buy a key staffer a lunch to get to know them was an important tool we used. To be able to go have a beer with committee staff after a markup was tremendously valuable. And it also made it a whole lot more fun to do. With a couple of notable exceptions, animal agriculture, production, agriculture, the feed industry, the grain industry, we never had the kind of dollars that lobbyists are supposed to have, that we could, wine and dine and, whisk members of Congress off to exotic places. I think the biggest change, Spence, is it's a less personal endeavor than it used to be. I talked to folks who were, baby lobbyists back in the 80s and 90s like I was, and they all agree. Those were kind of the golden days of ag lobbying, because we physically had to be up there. We got to know people. I mean, personally got to know them and had relationships. Not so much anymore. They're intellectual relationships, certainly, and we spend a lot of time on the Hill, but not nearly what we used to. And I miss it. It isn't as much fun as it used to be.
So what's to blame for that? Is it the advent of technology? Is it changes in the legislative process? What do you think really drove that change that you're talking about?
I think a lot of it is the technology, the inherent laziness of human beings. That if I can email or send a cell call up or text or whatever, that I'm not going to haul my my butt up there. I think it's a change in the political tenor of Congress. It's far less collegial than it used to be. Kika de la Garza, when he was chairman of the House Ag Committee, was fond of telling people, politics is the art of the possible. And in order to reach possible, you have to compromise. You're not going to get everything you want, you never will, but you're going to get a lot of what you need. And that seems to have disappeared. There's way too much my way or the highway up there. Way too much arrogance that I know best how this country should operate. The other 434 members of the House and the other 99 members of the Senate apparently are wandering in the wilderness somewhere. And that's unfortunate. I think that's one of those things that has probably acted as a disincentive to a lot of talented people who may have wanted to be a member of Congress. And the other part of it is the money. There's just way too much money up there. When a House member gets elected, they get 15 minutes of the thrill of victory, and then they start hitting the phones for fundraising again. And that's something that I don't know that the Congress, House, Senate, male, female, Democrat, Republican has the guts to tackle that, frankly.
I was speaking with someone that there was a former coworker of yours that said that at one point during staff meetings in your career, you were limited to one 90-second anecdote to offer up during staff meetings so as not to drive your coworkers crazy. So I'm going to give you the same challenge here. One 90-second anecdote of a particularly humorous visit you took to Capitol Hill at one point in your career.
One of my favorites, and this will embarrass the hell out of the guy who probably told you this. Richard Sellers, who is Senior Vice President of AFI, is a brilliant animal scientist and a brilliant nutritionist and has forgotten more about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act than a lot of people are going to ever know. When we had the cow that stole Christmas, the one BSE cow up in Washington State, and we were all hustling over to USDA to be briefed and ask questions and all those things, I got a call from the Ag LA for a New York congressman asking me to come up and explain myself to the congressman because he had read in Newsweek that it was all about what the cow ate. And it was, dairy feed that was giving cows mad cow disease. And I thought, well, I could go and wing this, but I'm going to take Richard. Richard can explain dairy diets, dairy feed formulation. And I spent a half hour with a congressman waving a copy of Newsweek magazine. And I had warned Richard going in. I said, you're not going to hear necessarily scientific fact. You're not going to be asked necessarily questions based on scientific fact. You are going to hear a frustrated New York congressman with dairy constituents who wants to know what the heck is going on. And you have to, and Richard sat there and he very politely listened, and when the congressman started waving Newsweek, but this magazine says, Richard very calmly looked at him and said, Congressman, I rarely take my scientific evidence from Newsweek magazine. At which point the congressman kind of sat there, looked at Richard, vibrated, and thanked us for coming by, and we hustled out the door. The other one that sticks in my mind is in the '85 Farm Bill, my very first Farm Bill as a lobbyist. The American Feed Industry Association, then American Feed Manufacturers Association, the American Meat Institute, and a broad coalition were pursuing a change in the Uniform Commercial Code. And it was called Clear Title for the Purchasers of Farm Products. Jesse Helms was chairman. And one of the funniest things that ever happened was Jesse Helms acceded to a demand by Senator Jake Garn, who was then banking chairman. And Mr. Garn had just come back from space. He was the first senator to fly in the space shuttle. I think it was the shuttle. And we went in for a hearing in Mr. Garn's banking committee, and there was a feed industry lobbyist, Joanne Smith, later Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, was president of Cattlemen, and she was a witness. A couple of bankers from Kansas, and a guy who had a livestock auction market up in Pennsylvania. And it was basically us saying what we thought, the bankers saying what they thought, and Mr. Garn lecturing us on can't we all just get along? Can't you find a compromise for this? And just as Mr. Garn started giving us his cross of gold, can't we all just get along, the livestock marketing witness looked up and goes, excuse me, don't you work for me? And we all just looked at the guy and he goes, like, I vote and elect you, and so don't you work for me? And poor Mr. Garn was just sort of gobsmacked, and he goes, I take your point, sir, and I'm just asking that you go ye therefore and compromise. This should not hold up a farm bill. It should not take the time of the banking committee. Thank you all for your time, and we were dismissed. And I got out in the hall, and I started laughing to the point I had tears coming down my cheeks. And Joanne Smith looked at me, and she said, why do you consider that so funny? I said, because everyone in that room has wanted to say that at some point in their career or another. And I said, bless him for doing it.
All right, so we've talked quite a bit about what you're doing when you're on the clock, but what about when you're not on Capitol Hill, when you're not walking the halls of an administration building, when you're not lobbying? What do you like to do in some of your personal free time?
Travel. If I can get out of the United States, if I can get to Europe, if I can get to London particularly, I'm a happy guy. So my wife and I, we go over 2 or 3 times a year if we can. Mm-hmm. There's a little town in the south of France to which we go a lot with some friends from back in the day. I read tons, and nothing that has anything to do with politics or nonfiction. I read escapist literature, I read science fiction, I read anything that will take me away from day-to-day Washington. I futz with some As my ninth grade creative writing teacher called it, expository writing. I hope to do more of that. And then I dink around in the art. You know, I tell people it's my therapy. I can turn my head off and pull weeds or prune trees or mow lawns. But, you know, as far as I'm a wicked needle pointer.
Really?
I'm an incredibly nervous person.
Okay.
I mean, any lobbyist who's ever worked an issue with me will tell you that I cannot be in the room when a vote is being taken. And so, because I have a tendency to say things out loud. So I will go and pace the halls. And I discovered, I don't know how I discovered it. I think it was because Rosie Greer did it. And he said, I do it because I'm a nervous person. And so I can whip through a needlepoint pillow in no time. Several of my family members have had these things foisted upon them when I'm finished, because what the hell am I going to do with them? But, you know, just whatever I can do to turn my mind off, I think, is what I seek. Just putzing around.
Yeah. What's your finest needlepoint creation to date?
A blue Chinese dragon pillow, 18 by 36.
That's pretty sizable.
Yep. I'm damn good.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'll wrap up this interview the same way I've wrapped up all of the ones in this series that came before it. If you could go back in time and talk to the version of Steve that first came to Washington all those years ago and offer him one piece of advice, what would that advice be?
Oh, geez. Not to be so hard on yourself. Like I say, I don't like to lose. And I can honestly say that where victory may have been deferred, I've never lost a major issue. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact I've never, at the Feed Industry Association nor with a client, ever been asked to lobby on anything in which I did not personally believe. I've never been asked to lobby on anything that I knew was wrong, just because a company wanted me to do it. I used to drive Frankie Trull, my partner at Policy Directions, crazy because I was known to fire clients because I just couldn't do it. I mean, you know, and I get that from my dad. My dad was, I think the worst thing I ever heard my father say in the worst case of anger he ever had was, "Oh, Jesus Christmas, that floors me." And I had a frustration and a learning experience where I had an item on the floor of the Senate. It should have been a slam dunk. The senator who was going to offer it said, "I'll be there, I'll do it, not a problem." And he got on a plane to go home. And so when the amendment process came up, and it was a very tight window, he wasn't there, and I was stupid enough not to have a backup. And so the amendment didn't get offered, it didn't get included, which meant I had to do 10 times more work subsequently. And I came back to my office, and I threw my briefcase against the wall. This was like 7:30 at night. And in walked Oakley Ray, the president of the American Feed Manufacturers Association, who had hired me. And he said, "What's the problem?" And I explained it to him. I said, "This is stupid. It shouldn't have happened. I don't like stupid, blah, blah, blah." And I was up against, it was a big union, didn't like what we were doing. And I said, "I especially don't like losing to those guys." And he goes, "How many lobbyists did they have working on this?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4. And he goes, "How big is their PAC?" And I said, "I have no clue how big their PAC is." And he said, and Oakley taught me, I think, the most important lesson. He said, "You do what you can do as long as you can honestly look at yourself and say, I did everything I could have done." And I said, "Well, in this case, I didn't have a backup to offer the amendment." And he goes, "You won't make that mistake again, will you?" So I would look back at myself and I would say, relax a little bit more. Take it a little bit easier on yourself. But back in those days, you had the energy. You know, you could take the knocks, and you know, you didn't mind spending 8 hours straight walking from office to office to office to office. I won't do that anymore. So I guess it's relax. You know, it's just take it easy on yourself.
Steve, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.